Hey, welcome back to Everyday Economics, a podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics and podcasts such as this one, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We are recording today's episode on Friday, April 21st. And joining me, as always, is my friend and colleague, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Hey, Dr. O, the audio clip that folks are about to hear, this is Elizabeth Warren speaking with Fed Chief Jerome Powell. This is from last month. Listen up.
We are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost, and they just have to bear it.
Well, will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation remains 5-6%?
Let me ask you about what happens if you do this. Since the end of World War II, there have been 12 times in which the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point within 1 year. Exactly what you're aiming to do right now. How many of those times did the U.S. economy avoid falling into a recession?
You know, it's not as black and white as very
looking
infrequent.
at the numbers. How many times did the economy fail to fall into a recession after doing that? Out of 12 times.
I think the number is 0.
I think the number is 0. That's exactly right.
Let's talk about this. This is a conversation that happened, like I said, about a month ago. What's wrong with this conversation?
Look, I think it's really important to tell our listeners that the Fed is not trying to kill the labor market. You know, a lot of people think that because the Fed is raising interest rates so aggressively and has, and a number of Fed officials, by the way, have come out and mentioned wage growth time and time again in their speeches, that people are like, you know, like, well, why is wage growth a problem, especially when wage growth at the bottom of the distribution, right? For groups that are lower income, who tend to be working in the service sector, who tend to historically have been kind of at the bottom of the wage distribution. That group is seeing the most rapid wage growth right now because of shortages in the services sector. You know, why is it, I guess, that, you know, the Fed is trying to cool wage growth in a moment like this? And I think that's a lot of the commentary that we hear from policymakers in Washington, D.C. And I'm here to say the Fed is not trying to kill the labor market. Look, core CPI, right? So let's talk about inflation a little bit. Inflation is coming down. But when you look at core CPI, which basically makes up the goods that are where government set prices, volatile food and energy, you know, when you strip out those factors, core CPI is actually heating up. It's cooled a lot since last June, but it actually went up in March, right? So it was annual core CPI increased 5.6% from a year ago in March, and that's up from 5.5% a month ago. And so the Fed is really worried about that. Shelter inflation remained the largest contributor to the monthly gain in the consumer price index, and shelter makes up 40% of CPI. So let me just kind of explain the relationship. Why the focus on wage growth, right?
Yes, let's do that.
Inflation is essentially the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP, right? And you can think of these as, you know, in simple terms, demand and supply. You know, wage growth is a good proxy for growth in nominal GDP or demand side of the economy, while productivity growth is essentially real GDP growth, right? Or the supply side of the economy. And we know that from data from Q4 2022 data that productivity had kind of been declining, right? And so unless wage growth comes down to where productivity growth is at, inflation is going to remain high, right? So let me say that. So long as wage growth remains high relative to productivity growth, we're going to have an inflation problem. And so
let me just ask you a quick question. Do you think that there's, you know, that this is kind of not to say a manufactured story, but a story that benefits from sort of billboard news moments? Like, for example, like in the coming week, Disney's going to announce, it has said it will be laying off a bunch of people. Whole Foods said they were going to be making some cuts to their corporate team. Clorox was going to be making some cuts as well. Do you think that stories like that sort of, create a perception about the job force and the labor market as a whole when bigger brands, and like, of course, inside of Disney, ESPN is going to be laying some people off. Does that?
The big headlines matter, right? Because it gives people that perception that the labor market is not on solid ground. But really, it's about, if you decompose this by sector or industry, what you'll notice is that the goods producing sectors are seeing a big cool down in hiring and maybe a small uptick in layoffs, mostly concentrated at, you've seen the big tech layoffs, goods producing. Some of the discretionary space as well is going to start to see a cooling of the labor market. But when you look at the services, right, you look at, some industries that basically that are labor intensive. Those industries, you still have an excess number of job openings. And we saw in the latest JOLTS release, right, the job openings and labor turnover survey, that basically you had that despite an increase in labor force participation and a large decrease in the number of job openings, the labor market remained extremely tight, especially in the services sector, right? And that is putting upward pressure on wages, right? And like I said, that upward pressure on wages, that's wage growth, right? And we want wage growth. We don't want wage growth to remain high relative to productivity growth. So either we get an increase in productivity, which at this point I would call a miracle increase in productivity. We need some sort of new thing that raises the productivity of workers, or wage growth has to come down. And wage growth doesn't have to come down, with people getting laid off. It could just come down with fewer hires, right? With firms, tapering, kind of slowing down the pace of hiring. And so anyway, the labor market tightness, the ratio of vacancies to unemployed workers to job seekers is definitely telling us something about inflation. And so, and the rent component of inflation tends to be more responsive to changes in labor market conditions, because it turns out that, when wage growth is very high, people tend to go out and get more new housing.
I appreciate the thoughts today. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.